Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we're going to be speaking with Nick Gvosdev, who is FPRI's editor of Orbis, our quarterly journal of world affairs, and Dr. Suzanne Loftus, who is the author of one of the articles in the Spring Orbis edition, that article being entitled Democracy and Transatlantic Values in an Age of Great Power Competition. I'd like to also let you all know that our event today is part of our brand new Robert Strauss Who Pay program. FPRI, as many of you know, has been devoted to studying and encouraging closer transatlantic relationships since its founding, which drew on the convictions of our founder, Robert Strauss Who Pay, who considered a vibrant Atlantic community essential to the security and prosperity of the West. Even as American strategy and the work of FPRI has and should adapt to the geopolitical context, we remain mindful of the original vision of our founder. This year, thanks to seed money from a generous donor, Mr. Ira Strauss, FPRI has been pleased to announce the launch of the Strauss Who Pay Atlantic System in a World of Great Power Rivalry project, which seeks to relate the study of the Atlantic system to our changing contemporary world. We'd also like to say today thank you to our members and supporters, and also encourage our audience to consider how they can help support the work of the new Robert Strauss Who Pays project this year and in the years to come. Before we get started with our program, and I turn it over to Nick Gvosdev, I'd just like to also let you know that we will be taking questions from our audience, so please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator today, as I mentioned, is Nick Gvosdev, and in addition to being a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program and the editor of our Orbis journal, he's also a professor of national security affairs and economic geography and national security at the U.S. Naval War College. He's also a senior fellow at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C., and he was also a Rhodes Scholar who received his doctorate from Oxford University, as well as the co-author of U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Strategy, The Rise of an Incidental Superpower, and the co-author of Russian Foreign Policy, Vectors, Sectors, and Interests. We'll also be putting into our chat box apps if it becomes appropriate, if we're discussing this particular places in the world. Our audience has asked us to do this so that you can sort of geolocate yourself and be able to follow more closely. I know for one, I'm a person who likes to look at a map when I hear about a particular place. So we try to accommodate that desire on the part of many in our audience. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Nick. Take it away.
Thank you, Raleigh. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today and to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I've put her full biography into the link to her full biography in the chat room, but she's my colleague because she teaches at the George C. Marshall Center for European Studies in Garmisch in Germany. She's a professor of national security there. And she's the deputy chair of the Strategic Initiatives Department, has an extensive background in Russian and European affairs, and has toggled back and forth between academia, the business world, and international organizations. So she's both been a scholarly observer and a practitioner in that regard. The timing of the article that she wrote for Orbis, and we've put out a link to it in the chat. It was sent out as part of the invitation for this event, and I hope everyone has had a chance to at least glance at it or will bookmark it to look at it, is to really bring back this question of are there shared values, shared ways of looking at the world, shared ways of conducting domestic governance, and also about how the international order ought to be structured and set up and managed are there sufficient shared commonalities across the Atlantic Ocean between the United States and Canada, and then the countries of NATO and the European Union, which can provide a basis for shared action in a world which is becoming more politically, in terms of international politics, is becoming more pluralistic, where the idea of the United States as the hyperpower at the hub, at the center of the system, is giving way to where the United States by itself and in conjunction with its European partners are still major actors, but there are now other games in town, starting with the rise of China. If we are entering into an era of great power competition, is this merely power politics and a clash of economies and a clash of political systems, and God forbid that it turn into an overt military clash, but also are there ideological foundations? Are there ways of looking at this, at great power competition, which isn't just simply large states that are interacting and clashing in the international arena, but also the question of, does this reflect differences in how the world ought to be organized and how states and societies ought to organize themselves? And so I think this brings us to a critical point. This, of course, article was generated, and we were discussing it just in the broader context of the transatlantic relationship, regardless of who happens to be in power at any given point in Washington, London, Berlin, Paris, who's sitting in Brussels. But it has acquired a degree of salience in that the incoming administration has identified the transatlantic relationship as a priority, and has also at least signaled an interest in reaching out to see whether or not common values are a way to build up and sustain security partnerships and economic relationships. So with that, Suzanne, let me turn the floor over to you. Take us through the argument as you'd like to. Any things that have changed since you've written it, or points you'd like to bring up, the floor is completely yours, and take us away and start this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that kind introduction and for that very useful summary. And of course, thank you to the FPRI for this invitation. I'm very delighted to be here today, and I'm happy to see that we have a full audience tuning in to listen to this very important matter in international relations. And I'm really especially looking forward to your thoughts and comments after my intervention. So as mentioned, I will be elaborating on my article that I wrote, and the theme of the article is current threats to democracy in our current age that has been defined as a return to great power competition. I will start by laying out the problems and the threats, and then suggest some possible solutions before we open it up for discussion. So to start from the very beginning, the threats to the so-called liberal democratic order that was founded after World War II on principles of peace, human rights, freedom, international legal norms, prosperity, these threats are emerging both from within and from without. So internally, the US and the EU are both experiencing struggles such as inequality, populism, polarization, racism, immigration issues. And this has really weakened the level of trust in the citizens towards their leaders and undermined democracy in the West. Internationally, the US 2018 National Defense and Security Strategies have both been revised to include the threat of so-called revisionist states of Russia and China. So what that means, revisionist states, meaning states that are actively working to undermine the foundations of that order. Examples include Russia's annexation of Crimea or China's island building projects in the South China Sea. Both have, defied these international norms that were founded. So now what we're seeing is Russia, China, and the US really vying for influence across the globe, and a return to this so-called great power competition to define this current era. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was hoped and assumed that liberal democracy would prevail and that the whole world would democratize and that we would achieve peace and prosperity for all. These are Wilsonian principles. Fukuyama even coined the phrase "the end of history" to define the epoch, saying that humanity had reached the end point of its ideological evolution, and that we would all become liberal democracies, and that this would be the final form of human governance. But as we can all see from today, this didn't come to fruition. And our states are majorly competing ideologically and also trying to reestablish spheres of privileged interests in their near abroad, as well as vying for influence internationally. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of China. What does that even mean? How is China really rising and posing a threat to the United States? So both the US and China are growing in aggregate power, but the US currently is growing at a slower rate than China. But China is still far behind the US on GDP per capita. And it's currently trying to move from a middle-income country to a high-income country, which historically has been actually a very difficult feat for any nation to achieve. China has also expanded its influence in international assistance programs, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the 17+1 arrangement in Central and Eastern Europe, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the BRICS Association, just to name a few. There are several more. And much like the United States, it also is involved in creating public educational organizations and international media resources, and has created these Confucius Institutes that are actually presently reaching about 100 different countries right now. And also one important point to mention is that China's development assistance internationally is now on par with that of the United States and unrivaled by any other nation. Also, China's investments on technology is quite impressive. It invested hundreds of billions of dollars in robotics, in artificial intelligence, in green energy. And while we used to call China a country that steals and imitates technology, now it actually improves it and pioneers it. It has invested massively into research and development and is actually expected to overtake the United States in spending in R&D by 2025. You might remember the predicament that the US found itself in with Huawei and China last summer. The US threatened to end its intelligence cooperation with its close allies if they adopted the Huawei system into their countries. But however, the US didn't actually offer any attractive alternatives. So that's an important thing to consider. And countries internationally are really finding it increasingly beneficial to do business with China. They've been dependent on, some of these countries have been dependent on the United States and the EU before, and now have access to new trading routes linked to the Indo-Pacific basin. Now, the concern about that is that will China attempt to coerce its trading partners in the developing world and adopt its system of governance? But I personally don't think that is the case. There is a lot of debate about that. And we can also see that when the United States became an influential trading partner for China, hoping that China would liberalize, that didn't happen. So, it's not always the case that this happens when a trading relationship is established. But nevertheless, it's very important that China could gain influence over these nations, and this would undermine Western influence and liberal norms throughout the world. For example, it's not uncommon for Beijing to request neutrality, let's say, in their partner stance when the US denounces China, let's say for human rights abuses. Also, China's growing range of economic and diplomatic interests would also translate into more Chinese security presence globally. The Indian Ocean in particular may see even greater Chinese activity as Chinese interests increase in this region. The People's Liberation Army, which is the name of China's military, is undergoing massive reforms, and Xi Jinping aims to transform it into a force that can dominate the Indo-Pacific region. And the Chinese military is ranked actually currently among the world's leading militaries in areas such as artificial intelligence and anti-ship ballistic missiles. So China has really demonstrated some important growth in the last decade or so. That's not to say that its influence abroad is always met positively. It's often met with criticism, let's say for faulty loans or hostage diplomacy or non-sustainable investments in their infrastructure projects. They've been known to use debt traps, which means intentionally extending credit to countries that can't pay it back so that China can extract economic or political concessions afterwards. And also domestically, its population is getting older. It's projected to contract by 5 million per year as of 2029. So before achieving the high income status that they wish, they'll definitely need to pay for the welfare of the older society. Also, its potential for global leadership is skeptical. I mean, we all remember the lethal cover-up of the pandemic and when it first broke out. Also, it uses bullying in its diplomatic tactics. It uses extra territorial belligerence. It has controversial approaches to development and ongoing human rights issues, of course, as we all know. It's also their infrastructure projects have lost some appeal because of concerns over transparency and environmental degradation and the flood of Chinese workers in countries where the locals believe that they would, have jobs instead. So that's to say that it might be premature at this point to overestimate the reach and appeal and demand for Chinese leadership abroad. So there's also an ideological component in this threat emanating from our rivals currently, but this is not the same as during the US-Soviet competition. Today, the Chinese Communist Party leaders are not so blatantly promoting their ideology the way that the Soviets did. And while the Soviets sought the destruction of capitalism and Western institutions, China is an active participant in many multilateral organizations. It doesn't outwardly coerce countries to adopt their economic practices as alternatives to US capitalism. But nevertheless, the more China gets involved internationally, the more there is this type of normative cover for autocratic regimes, because it rejects the universality of human rights and freedom and democracy. It rather champions sovereignty and expects deference in its behavior. So now let's talk about Russia a little bit. Russia presents a very different type of threat than China does. First of all, it's the largest country in the world. It has an abundance of natural resources, an impressive nuclear arsenal, and in the last decade, it's significantly modernized its military. What does Russia want? Well, it seeks a more multipolar world order with different centers of power, and it wants to be free to practice its regional hegemony, or basically influence over its near abroad. And of course, it wants to be able to operate the way that it does domestically without the West getting involved. And internationally, it rejects a value-based foreign policy, and it has accused the United States of practicing that in its efforts to democratize many nations throughout the world. And so even though it has less economic power, it can wield influence in many other ways. Moscow has used targeted military action, military buildup near NATO's eastern flank, arms sales. It inserts itself as a mediator in international conflicts. And also it actively tries to exacerbate pre-existing societal rifts in Western societies, to foster division, kind of divide and conquer strategy. And it does this with both social media platforms and conventional media platforms, and its bilateral engagements and relationships with the different leaders throughout the world. And so now COVID-19 has, of course, affected this great power competition. International polls say that both the United States and China have poorly handled the pandemic. And also it reflected poorly on NATO and the West at large, that they were competing for personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals. They didn't show a united front. And then China sees this opportunity to present itself as the responsible actor. And it portrayed itself as helping Italy, helping Serbia, said the United States was absent, and that the EU is absent as well. And then now it's kind of showing off that it's contained the virus while everybody else is still struggling. And we're also seeing vaccine diplomacy efforts by Russia and China. The EU is currently struggling with its rollout, and we're seeing countries opting for the Sputnik 5. China is vaccinating Latin America and other parts of the world as well. So that's something interesting that we can see, the great power dynamics in, the COVID-19 issue. Sorry, just going to drink some water. Okay, so we covered the international threats to democracy, but there's also some serious domestic threats that we need to address in our societies. That's not COVID-19, I'm sorry, I'm just losing my voice. Okay, so we have witnessed domestically problems with long-term wage stagnation. We've witnessed a rise in populism, a rise in automation, exporting of jobs to China, a growing mistrust of immigrants. There's been a lot of domestic problems to deal with. And this has also showed the international community that we're not really, dealing with our issues at home. And due to our last several years of having a more populist inclined leader, the world is worried that this might happen again, because under the Trump administration, the US wasn't its normal leader of the free world. It wasn't its normal leader in multilateral organizations. So that remains an issue. And it's also important to mention that there's quite a bit of division, both within the Democratic parties and the Republican parties. Democrats are divided among themselves. The Republicans are now kind of more nativistic and nationalist. It's important to remember that 74 million people voted for Trump. That's more than any other candidate besides Biden, who got 81 million people. So we're very likely to continue, having some problems with polarization in the US society. So given all these dynamics, we can tell that this so-called Wilsonianism that I mentioned in the beginning is in retreat. It's a project that requires a lot of convergence. And we can see today that Russia and China and India and Turkey also all seem less likely to convert on liberal democracy than in 1990. So something's going on here. They developed economically and technologically, just as the West wanted, but instead of becoming more like the West, which is the assumption of Wilsonianism, rather, they instead wanted to achieve deeper independence from the West and pursue civilizational and political goals of their own. So we can see now that there's more risks and costs, of the West intervening in conflicts as other actors are now involved. We saw this in Syria. And it also gives smaller nations more possibilities of who to do business with or who to side with, whereas before they may not have wanted to resist the status quo. Now they're given more options. And another example is of Wilsonianism being in retreat, is that NATO is facing existential threats. As an alliance, it was founded on these values that now we see are backsliding in some of the member states, such as Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. And this really endangers the notion of the alliance as a like-minded security community. But for this Wilsonianism to persist, it's very important to have a constituency in the United States that would support it. But now, because of a generation of reaching too far and poor political judgments, getting involved in Iraq or Libya has really garnered very little enthusiasm for democracy building projects abroad among the citizens of the United States. So now there's a new administration. Biden is a committed transatlanticist. That will be a big difference in the future of the relationship between Europe and the United States. But trust might be a bit difficult to restore right away. This is an important hour of need. We need to end this pandemic. The US can take a global leadership role for vaccination rollouts. That would be a great opportunity for the US to reestablish itself as a leader. As for China, decoupling is probably not the best solution. Our economies are way too intertwined, and we're not going to be able to convince other countries to decouple from China either. But we need to engage and compete with China at the same time. We need to engage with our allies in Asia through trade deals, through military exercises. We need to invest in infrastructure development projects. We need to ensure presence and commitment in the Indo-Pacific. The US needs to stay competitive on 5G, artificial intelligence, renewable energies. One thing that we have over China is our network of friends and allies, which we should not underestimate, especially at this time. Climate change is another area. Getting tough on China on trade was essential, and they need to cooperate with us more if they want to continue being trading partners. We need to restore US leadership in international institutions. This is a part of our soft power. If the US doesn't provide more funding for institutions, these institutions will increasingly become driven by Chinese finance and personnel, and therefore their interests. There's been talk about diversifying our supply chains, which we saw was necessary at the beginning of the pandemic as we relied on a single point of failure. So a re-regionalization of supply chains could be in order, partially, as well as a diversification. This also addresses the issue of the human aspect of offshoring that we've been, facing. Small towns, for example, are being hollowed out as a result of not having enough blue-collar jobs available. We need to think about them too. With Russia, we need a good deterrence posture on the eastern flank. We need to continue to support Ukraine and encourage the implementation of the Minsk agreement. We need to address their aggressive and revisionist acts in order to defend liberal democratic norms and laws. Otherwise, we lose credibility. Nevertheless, we should engage with Russia also in areas of mutual interest. So arms treaties, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change, and engage Russian civil society. We need to build more trust among nations because we don't trust each other at all, but we might find that we have much more in common than we thought. And most importantly, not to isolate Russia to the point that it gets pushed into the arms of China. That would be a strategic mistake. In Central and Eastern and Southern Europe, we need to support in infrastructure projects and engage them. 3Cs initiative is an excellent way to invest in infrastructure development in that region, to modernize it, to get it away from its post-Soviet legacy, and to compete with Chinese investment in the region. And of course, support the Greater Balkans, not let Russia and China dominate this region, who really wants more support from the West as well, from what I've gathered listening to parliamentarians and government representatives in the region. As for Europe, they've often talked about going their own way or strategic autonomy in case the United States is not able to defend them or protect them if they have to move most of their forces to the Indo-Pacific. So it's not practical to go your own way like that. It's more that we need to encourage more European defense and military spending, and take more and have Europeans take more responsibility for their defense, but within the transatlantic framework, without resorting to protectionist policies with their defense equipment, and just reinforcing the transatlantic alliance, because it's something that we really need at this moment in our difficult strategic times. And as for democracy itself, we need to focus on democratic protection rather than expansion. So, for example, not confronting countries such as Hungary and Poland for backsliding, that's a win for the autocratic camp. We need to think about diplomatic tools and pressures on backsliding allies. Maybe some reforms are needed in the EU and NATO, reforms to decide how to deal with members whose character has changed. These institutions are founded on principles of democracy and rule of law and individual liberty. So they must portray these values, otherwise they risk drifting into dysfunction and irrelevance. Already, member states appear to favor China and Russia, such as the Czech Republic or Hungary, Slovenia, and Turkey. This is something that needs to be addressed to protect democracy. And we need to be much more responsible in our information space. Social media companies and regular media companies need to be much more responsible. They need to carefully present information, rely less on sensationalism. This is for the conventional media, because this tends to really increase polarization in our society. And nowadays, the coordination of political mobilization is done on social media companies' platform. So this poses really unique threats to well-functioning democracies, and it's new. So we need to think about regulation. We need to think about antitrust laws, data protection, or even middleware, which is software with transparent algorithms that the user can choose him or herself. Strategic communication is a key issue that we need to improve on. We need to do a better job of communicating with the population on critical policy issues and why they're important. Right now, the American public is confused and angry, and they think their leaders are betraying American interests for their own nefarious interests and globalist interests. Joe Biden and his administration need to better explain why the world order that was created after World War II is important and why it still matters. And we can, increase our investment in our strategic presence throughout the world on social media, on the radio, and the TV, leverage new communications. And this is all for soft power influence. During the pandemic, we saw billboards of Xi Jinping in Syria and Vladimir Putin being the hero, and these guys helping everyone while the West was highly portrayed as absent. So something there also needs to be done. So to end my intervention today, I think that we need to talk about pragmatism as a way forward. Drawing on diverse theoretical traditions such as realism and liberalism to make decisions would help the US see the world clearly and operate more effectively. The climate in the world has completely changed. There's conflicting sets of values all operating in the world, either together or in competition with one another. Flexibility is important. We need to think sharp and on our feet and quickly. So practicing a mix of cooperation and competition with our adversaries while deeply engaging our allies is of utmost importance at this time. And honestly, the only way to hold the strategic edge is to take care of democracy at home and unite with other like-minded democracies to uphold the system of liberal democratic practices. And then other nations will want to naturally gravitate towards that. So being a good example at home and uniting with friends and allies that are like-minded in itself is, the way forward. So now I'd really love to hear your thoughts, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Suzanne. And again, encouraging everyone, already some questions coming in, encouraging people to use the Q&A box to pose questions to Dr. Loftus for her point here. And so what I'd like to do is to actually just take the moderator's prerogative and start us off with this discussion by referencing another piece that appeared not in this issue of Orbis, but in the previous one, which was the conversation between Ian Brzezinski and Bridge Colby about NATO and the West dealing with the challenge of Russia and China. And at the end of that conversation, Bridge Colby, who served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense not too long ago in the Trump administration, made the point that he thought that the values question, while it's important, is not sufficient as a basis for collective action among a set of like-minded states, that it needs to be grounded more in practical challenges, security threats, so on and so forth. Just throwing that off to you as a starting point, which is, how far does shared values get us down the track in terms of forging partnerships, and at what point is that going to be insufficient?
Yeah, I mean, Nick, we're already seeing a lot of competing, interests and sets of. Well, can we translate interest to values? That's the question. It's just our Western alliance, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, the United States. We all have competing sets of interests while maintaining fundamental interests together. So perhaps the main interests, which are to limit the influence of perhaps more autocratic states around the world, is enough for us to set aside our differences and continue to work towards the objective of consolidating our relationship. So, I mean, it's a great way is to take the threat of Russia. Who thinks Russia is a threat? Eastern European countries mostly. The south of Europe, not so much. The West, Germany wants to do business with Russia, especially this pipeline that they're building. They want to go forward with it, and it's not necessarily something in line with what the strategic way forward should be when the West plans out how it will approach Russia. But nevertheless, I think that the EU and the US could definitely reach an understanding on how to potentially deal with a rising China and how to deal with a disruptive Russia. So everybody imposed sanctions on Russia, for example, on Ukraine, even if maybe they personally didn't care so much about it. They all imposed sanctions because it was a united front, and that showed a commitment to, pointing out when an actor defies international legal norms. So if we can continue to act in those ways, at least, I think that, that would be enough to not let us descend into some chaos or arrangement where everyone is for himself and there's no unity among us. I mean, it's a very complex question. Honestly, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Well, since we've got so many questions coming in, let me bookmark that perhaps for another session and do that there. But what I'd like to do is to group together a number of the questions that are coming in, that there's a certain degree of symmetry. And I want to pose these to you and get your reactions. Larry Holman has been posting in and starting off, I think, on a point that he raises about the finite nature of this planet to support its population. And this, of course, ties directly into the question of shifts in the climate and resource depletion. Do we need to shift to a new set of values in order to cope with that, and whether or not, the sort of current free market system is contributing to some extent to the crisis that we're facing, and how do we engender cooperation among states? I think that that's an interesting line, in fact, that given that we're already seeing tensions within the Biden administration between kind of the portfolio that former Secretary of State John Kerry has as the climate envoy versus Secretary of State Blinken, and certainly with regard to the question of China, we see a real split there between working with China in essence to save the planet versus pushing back on China's revisionism. With that, Randall Newman Newnham also asked, what did you think about Biden's proposed summit of democracies, and how helpful can this be? With that, a question from St. Minashi, who asks about where does India fit in to this question of democracies, of partnerships. So let me start with that question there, and then I'll go back and I will group another set of questions for you.
Okay, so thank you very much for those very interesting and important questions. Climate change indeed has become one of the most important issues that we need to deal with today, and we have now a president in the United States who believes that as well, and who will rejoin Paris, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and take charge to ensure that the United States at least participates in the climate goals. So, of course, it's hard to predict the future, but it's true that our current capitalist system does, in fact, worsen climate issues. And we might have to resort to a system where the state gets much more involved into capitalism. And this is going to be a very controversial issue. People are going to resist that and think that it's mimicking a fascist economy because there's too much government regulation. But this will be a very, big topic, and that's a very important question that you asked. Now, the Summit of Democracies gathering is vital. That's a great idea that Biden had, and it allows democratic nations, or even those that are currently experiencing democratic backlash, or who are not quite as consolidated of a democracy as maybe they once were, they should also be included. And there should be a promotion, as Biden wants, of discussing how to improve democracy at home, because that's one of his priorities. And he agrees with the fact that democracy promotion starts at home before expanding abroad. And this, to loop in the question about India, India should definitely be implicated, because there are some debates about whether they should include countries that are now kind of run by populists and that, a bit questionable on their practices, but India should definitely be included, and we should continue to cooperate with India because it's a very key ally in the region, just like we should cooperate with all of our like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific basin and in the Asia-Pacific region as well. So thank you for those questions.
All right, let me group another set of questions for you. Lawrence Gregory Bloomquist asked about Russia appearing to sow discontent, not just in the US, but among its allies. And one of them is to obviously the Russian hand in encouraging separatist movements. And he references the Catalan separatists in Spain. And he asks about can we do more things to reveal these covert aggressions more effectively? Tying into that, an anonymous attendee asks about if democracy seems to be on the defensive and the authoritarian states seem to be moving forward, should we do more offense to expose what they're doing, not only in the diplomatic arena, but in mainstream and social media as well? And let me group one kind of related question to that from Victor Bjorgan, who asks specifically about the vaccine question in Latin America, that, and he references particularly Argentina, but other states in the region. Is there with the kind of the Russian, the Chinese, even the Cuban efforts, is one effort here for the United States and by extension Europe as well to be doing more in terms of vaccine diplomacy?
Well, the support for separatists that Russia has, been involved with in basically all of its modern history is a tactic to prevent the nations it considers in its sphere of influence from joining the West. As long as there is open conflict in these regions or countries, they will not be able to join NATO or the EU and will therefore be kept under the Russian orbit. And as was mentioned, Russia has engaged in, covert, as you say, operations, or rather, I would say more specifically through the information space, direct propaganda, or, just messages, political messages influencing separatists. Because this again goes into the strategy of dividing and conquering. When you encourage division in a society, you weaken the citizens' trust in the institutions that currently exist, and you weaken the value of the whole liberal project. I mean, there's so much EU skepticism these days, and Russia really capitalizes on key vulnerabilities in these regions. So can we do more to expose them? We can definitely do more in the information space. We can point out on social media platforms we can have either our own, for example, software that I was talking about, this middleware, or basically you as the user of a social media platform can choose to have your information displayed to you in a more clear, or what's the word, transparent way, so that they can mention to you, this statement is controversial, or this statement is not 100% accurate. This statement is only supported by this type of people who believe these types of things. So it kind of allows you to understand what you're reading and where it comes from. So if we can encourage that in our social media platforms, I think that could help expose what's going on and who is sharing the information and what, the objective of sharing that specific type of opinion is, for example. This is the same for, should we be more on the offense for rising authoritarianism? We just need to fix our polarization. And we need to engage civil society. We need to communicate with our citizens about why the actions that we're taking are important. Why is NATO important? I bet if you asked an average American, he or she will have no idea. So we need to do a much better job at explaining why we're so involved internationally as a global leader, as the United States is so involved globally, and that it's not just a ploy for nefarious objectives that are, and trying to reject the American population. It's so not necessarily bolster the offensive. I would say more improve the domestic situation, just improve what it is at home, deal with polarization, tribalism, inequality, manage that, and then you'll be more bulletproof, I think is the term to say. And for vaccine diplomacy, this has been a disaster in the EU. I'm currently living in Germany right now, and we are just waiting and waiting and waiting for our turn to get vaccinated. The United States is doing a fantastic job. Everybody there is vaccinated, or at least allowed to be vaccinated at this point, and we're not still. And this has, been due to multiple issues, mostly political. So, and this is a global pandemic. I mean, this is an emergency, and we're allowing politics to get in the way of that. I mean, that's disgraceful. So yes, we need to, up our diplomatic efforts with the vaccine rollout, and we need to save people. We need to end this thing because everybody's tired of these Zoom meetings, So again, thank you for those great questions.
Yeah, no, just one point to add on with your point, and you've said it in the presentation as well about, explaining and making the case to domestic populations. And just to put my Carnegie Council hat on, the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, we found that in our work that people are responsive to things like NATO if you can show how it benefits their health, their digital security, their economic security, and really that connecting those pieces together becomes quite important. Let me get to another batch of questions here. General Tansel Çokhusel, who's the Turkish Defense Attaché in Washington, asks about does the presence of the U.S. in Syria contribute to great power competition? And then raises, of course, the Kurdish question in Syria and the risk of losing Turkey as an ally or as a NATO member, how that may play out. I wanted to combine two questions that came in on Russia and China. One from Mohsin Hashim about did we mismanage kind of handling Russia at the end of the Cold War? And then Kim Bursey's question about China's objectives in Asia, both of which I think come at this question of are China and Russia revising orders that they believe were revisionist to them? And therefore, it's just kind of, well, they're just trying to revise it back to something else. And then combining that with Nikolaos's question that do we run the risk that with Russia, the more that Russia is sanctioned by the West, that we are going to essentially create the self-fulfilling prophecy of China and Russia already? Are they already partners against the United States? And is that a risk that we're going to run, that we are going to create that partnership among the revisionist powers in ways that may be detrimental to the interests of the West?
Great questions. So of course, I mean, we can start with the Syria question. It's not only Syria, it's Ukraine. We can see the presence of great powers and regional powers in these conflicts. So yes, the presence of the United States in Syria, as well as the presence of Russia, as well as Turkey's interests, have all demonstrated, the values that each of these actors are trying to defend. And poor Syria is just
Yeah.
destroyed from within. And Turkey is a very, I don't know what adjective to use, but you know, lately it has wanted to establish more regional power, more regional hegemony, more interests in its in where it is located, and it has also decided to partner or procure, you know, weapons from Russia, which is very unusual for a NATO member to do. And what can NATO do with an ally that doesn't share the same interests necessarily or the same values, you know, lately, especially. Turkey is very strategically placed on the Black Sea. And for NATO, it's a very important ally. So it's very tricky to just say, okay, Turkey, you're misbehaving, so you're out of the alliance. That's maybe not the solution, but there should be, as I said, a way to you know, kind of not name and shame, but, you know, recognize when an ally is not behaving the way that they promised they would when joining the alliance, and to have some repercussions for those actions. Otherwise, everybody is just going to do what they want, and that's not the point of having the institution to begin with. Now, the question on whether Russia was mishandled after the Cold War, you'll find many different scholars giving you many different answers, but I would personally say absolutely, because we as the West assumed that when the Cold War ended, Russia would just enter the West and be like the West and adopt everything that we had established. And for Russia, that's not how it was. Russia thought that now that the war was over, they would join and all of them would be the leaders of a new world order, that they would transcend this world order and agree on a new set of way, on a new way forward. So leaving Russia out of many important international relations decisions and international security decisions has, you know, showed them that the West didn't consider it an equal partner, and it eventually developed and didn't need to abide by the West anymore and went its own way and was pushed away. That's not to say Russia didn't do anything, you know, bad, but we're talking about the specific way that the West treated Russia at that point in time. And yes, indeed, it's an excellent question that China and Russia are perhaps trying to revise an order that they think is revisionist, meaning that the United States is actually the revisionist actor. Because the Westphalian principles of state sovereignty that, you know, the international order was actually founded upon after World War II didn't really include this set of universalization of human rights into domestic politics, or the responsibility to protect into, you know, a sovereign nation when they're undergoing issues. These are all new additions that came after the end of the Cold War that Russia and China never accepted. So for them, the United States has behaved in revisionist ways, and they are trying to, what they say, restore justice, restore state sovereignty, and so that we don't interfere into the affairs of others in an ideological way. China's objectives, to follow up, somebody asked, in Asia, is to really have regional hegemony. Their army, their military is fully modernized now. They have, they're stationed in the islands that they artificially built in the East China and the South China Sea. A war, if it broke out there, would be not good. I mean, China has the upper hand. So the United States feels that it needs to bolster its capabilities in the region. And the more we sanction Russia, does it push it into the hands of China? Of course it does. But the thing is, we can't not sanction Russia, because then we don't show what norms and values we're trying to defend, and we lose credibility. And it's just not the way that the West should respond. You should always respond to an act that has went around international legal norms that were created and accepted by all actors. So, but it doesn't mean that we can't engage with Russia. We can engage with Russia while maintaining sanctions. And hopefully we can engage with Russia and end this war in Ukraine, because that's, even though I have a bad feeling that that won't happen. I know it's already 7 p.m. Central European time, and I would love to continue, but I'll leave it up to Nick.
No, I think, we've covered a good number of questions. I'm sorry that there's been some follow-ons that I don't think we're going to get to, but I think that what you've laid out for us here is quite critical, in that this is not just a something, the transatlantic relationship and really kind of the U.S. role in the international system isn't just something that is going to be fixed or altered with a few sets of policy changes here and there, that we really are at an inflection point in how the U.S. relates to its allies and to the world, and that, other powers get a vote, and the climate and the environment will get a vote in how all of this plays out. And certainly the domestic populations get a vote. That simply because this is what foreign policy experts say ought to happen doesn't necessarily mean that's what policy is going to be. If I could, just to close us, close this session down, to turn to Raleigh, if she's has any final pieces of advice or thoughts that she would like to give to our group today. But if not, I think we have reached the end of our time. Suzanne, thank you. Dr. Loftus, thank you very much for being with us. And again, knowing that you are a number of hours ahead of us in Germany, that taking the time out to be with us for a lunchtime discussion here. It is one of the benefits of Zoom that we've discovered over the last year, is that we don't necessarily have to be geographically proximate to have people and events. Thank you everyone for commenting. Please always, even after we're finished here today, the conversations go on the social media pages of FPRI. You can comment on things, you can comment on the articles and the like. So certainly don't feel that this is the end of this particular conversation. And so Suzanne, thank you very much again for being with us. We'll see how what you described in your Orbis piece unfolds, and certainly we'll want you to be able to comment in the months and years moving forward, to see how what you've anticipated in the piece has turned out.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really enjoyed our session today. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We'll bid everyone a good day, and we'll see you at our next event for Orbis itself, for the Orbis series next week. At this time next week, we will be having Sophie Eisenstraat from the Munich Security Conference and Carolyn Kissane from New York University's Global Institute to talk about the concept of the polypandemic, which was another of the essays that appeared in the same issue as Suzanne's piece in Orbis, the spring issue. So certainly invite everyone to be with us again in a week's time. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.